Hey everyone. So today we are not going to have a look at maps of the Earth, but rather we're going to have a look at some trips into the sky. This is a really beautiful book to celebrate 60 years of NASA. It's by the Taschen Publishing House. We've looked at some of the books before. They're always really impressive with gorgeous images. And while preparing this video, I have to say I felt a little bit overwhelmed just because there is so much to go through and so much to choose from. So I figured the best way to approach this subject is by starting at the end of the book, where we have a NASA missions checklist over numerous pages. And I figured we could skim through these and then look up the individual spacecraft and see what they look like. We can't go through all of them because I think we'd still be here in 2 days. But we can come back to this book at some point if you'd like. So the different space flights also have quite a lot of information with them. There's the name of the mission, the date, how long it lasted, who was on board, and then some interesting information about it. On the side, we learn about the different astronaut titles, like Commander, Command Module Pilot, Lunar Module Pilot, Flight Engineer, Mission Specialist, Pilot, Payload Specialist and Commander, Science Pilot and Senior Pilot. And especially in the later missions, you also have people from selected foreign space agencies on board. For example, from Mexico, from the Arab Satellite Communications Organization, from the Canadian or European Space Agency. There's the Israel Space Agency, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, Russian Space Agency, and the State Space Agency of Ukraine. Alright, so here the first ones are the Mercury missions from 1961 to 1963. These are already manned missions, so we're on the Human Spaceflight here. We have Mercury Redstone 3 on May 5th, 1961, Mercury Redstone 4, Mercury Atlas 6, 7, 8, and 9. And some of the interesting information we have: a suborbital flight that successfully put the first American in space. Here we learned that the capsule sank after splashdown, but the astronaut was recovered safely. Mercury Atlas 6 placed the first American into orbit. Then we have some more scientific experiments on board. Here we have a 6-orbit engineering test flight to prove Mercury's ability for longer missions, and then 22 orbits to evaluate the effects on an astronaut of more than a full day in space. Okay, let's see where the pictures are. have the Mercury spacecraft under construction at the McDonnell Aircraft Plant in St. Louis, Missouri. And the same company would later also create the two-man Gemini vehicles. Alright, so we have an image of the construction facility here with all of the different parts. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the rows here in the middle of desks upon desks with people working on them. And then here the actual Mercury spacecraft. This page, unfortunately, got some splashes. I don't know from where, but other than that, the book's in good condition, so don't worry about it. So in here we have a prototype Mercury spacecraft that's being tested at Langley's wind tunnel to assess how it will perform when re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. You can see one of the two propellers here in the background. And one engineer having a good look whether everything's okay. And another model here with a test of the heat shield materials at the rear. And this one was not listed. This is the attempted unmanned launch of Mercury Redstone 1 in 1960. And it's known by NASA insiders as the 4-inch flight because the Redstone barely lifted off the pad. But hey, still better than nothing. It's a first attempt, right? Alright, so that was Mercury. After that, we have a couple of Gemini missions from 1965 to 1966, so in a very short period of time. We started Gemini 3 in March 1965, which was the first manned Gemini flight consisting of 3 orbits. We continue in June and August, which was the first week-long flight. Then we skip ahead to December, and here the primary objective was to determine whether humans could live in space for 14 days. So they're really expanding on the time that the astronauts spent in space. With Gemini 6A, we have the first space rendezvous accomplished with Gemini 7. Gemini 8, we have another docking with another vehicle, an unmanned Agena, and then emergency return to Earth after thruster malfunction. And there's already some familiar names here. We have Neil Armstrong on board here, and then over here with Gemini 12 in November 66, we also have Buzz Aldrin. And there's 9A, 10, and 11, all with different missions. Okay, let's skip back to where we find the Gemini pictures. Alright, so up here we have Chief of the Astronaut Office, Dick Slayton, second from left, studying orbital charts with Gemini 3 crew, John Young on the left, Gus Grissom on the right, and backup astronaut Tom Stafford. That's probably him. Slayton was grounded for several years by a heart condition, but he flew into space at last in 1975. And then on the next pages we have the Rendezvous docking simulator at Langley, which prepared Gemini astronauts for the strange physics of orbital flight. For example, firing a rocket engine to try to catch up with the target on the same orbit can cause the target to move farther away. So that's what we see here. The Rendezvous docking simulator. And I know that's a small detail, but I really love this red. It just looks so 70s. I feel like some of our older Topper stuff is the same color. And we also have the familiar NASA logo here. I learned today that this one is nicknamed the Meatball. It was retired for a couple of years to use a different logo, but it's in use again today. And over here we have a familiar face. This is Buzz Aldrin trying out a gas-powered jetpack stored on the rear of a Gemini test capsule that might have enabled astronauts to maneuver more easily during spacewalks. The idea, however, was not tested successfully until the shuttle era of the 1980s. And here we see some of the astronauts trying out zero gravity. They were on board of a cargo plane. This is the Gemini 11 prime and backup crew. And I think these spacesuits probably also look quite familiar to most of you. In a command room here, without any screens. Bit of a different era. Alright, so there we are with the Gemini missions. And then we already get to the Apollo missions. The ones we have listed here are 1 to 17. But all in all, these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So a couple, 2 to 6 here, are not listed on the Human Spaceflight. Let's see. So we have the first successful manned flight on the Apollo program with Apollo-7. It was also the first live TV broadcast from a manned spacecraft. Apollo 8 was the first manned flight to orbit the moon and live TV broadcast from lunar orbit, with some iconic photographs taken of the Earth, seen from the moon and its far side. Apollo 9 was the first manned flight of all the Apollo lunar hardware in Earth orbit. Apollo 10, the rehearsal for the moon landing. And Apollo 11, the first manned lunar landing mission, July 20th, the Sea of Tranquility. EVA lasted 2 hours, 31 minutes and 40 seconds. US flag and scientific instruments deployed. Apollo 12 landed on the Moon on November 19th, 1969, to retrieve parts of the unmanned Surveyor 3, which had landed there in April 2 years prior. Apollo 13 was a lunar flyby and return. However, a malfunction forced cancellation of the lunar landing. Apollo 14 landed on February 5th, 1971. Apollo 15 was the first long-stage J-class mission. Orbital sensors and mapping cameras carried in the service module. First deployment of a lunar roving vehicle, an electric-powered car, which traversed a total of 17 miles or 27 kilometers. 3 EVAs conducted, totaling over 18 hours. And then there's Apollo 16 with a variety of surface experiments. And Apollo 17, the final Apollo lunar landing mission. Geologist Harrison H. Schmitt became the first scientist to land on the Moon. LRV traversed 19 miles or 13 kilometers. 3 EVAs conducted, totaling over 22 hours. Okay, let's see where the images are. It has a bit of a weird way of numbering the pages. You can see it here. It's 21143. So that stands for the chapters here on the front and then the page. Don't know if it necessarily makes it easier to read. Okay, here we are on the chapter on Apollo. First of all, we have the chariots for Apollo, which is a Saturn V. Here on the side we see a Saturn V engineering prototype and the launch towers on mobile platforms, surrounded by the newly completed vehicle assembly building. This one here. This was in 1966, a year when NASA expected these huge rockets to be operational for many years to come. However, political tides shifted by the end of the decade, and the Apollo program was shuttered in 1975. Still pretty successful, all things considered. And the vehicle assembly building, of course, is quite famous. I'm sure you've seen it on many different pictures. Here we have an early Apollo design with a very roomy interior. However, it had to be scaled down because of weight restrictions in the Saturn V launch vehicle. Looks quite comfy at this point. Here we have a prototype constant volume lunar spacesuit that was meant to avoid the problem of swelling up like a balloon in the vacuum of space. However, this too was too bulky for Apollo, and the final spacesuit featured stiffened fabrics at the joints and flexible fabrics elsewhere. Here we have another early mock-up of Apollo's command module. This one was smaller than they had hoped for, and in the end it was not part of the landing system. I love the description here. Retro rockets are tested to see whether an Apollo command module could withstand the landing on the ground. This game was not repeated. Here we have a test on the heat shield material. And here we have an unmanned surveyor lunar lander. This one was shot in the lava fields of Hawaii. It's a beautiful image, don't you think? Here we have the Apollo 1 crew relaxing during training in Houston. So I don't know how relaxing that really was. And this here finally is the Saturn V rocket that was put together. The description says that the oxygen tank of a Saturn V first stage is installed above the kerosene fuel tank. When we think of Apollo's achievements, welding is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. But entirely new techniques in automated welding were required to build the Saturn's tanks because no flaws could be allowed in their thin, lightweight walls. And you can see the people standing here on the side, so you really get an idea of the scale of the entire rocket. Quite impressive. So that was just the lower part here. Here we have the entire rocket. Ready to launch over here. Launched on November 9th, 1967, Apollo 4 was the first trial of a complete Saturn V stack. And then here we have the launch controls. And with Apollo 8 finally approaching the moon. This one I think is also quite fascinating. This is Margaret Hamilton. Her and her team at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory created the software for Apollo's onboard computer. And she is pictured here with a printout of the Apollo guidance computer code. And she said because software was a mystery, a black box, upper management gave us total freedom and trust. There was no choice but to be pioneers. So yeah, it's basically as tall as her. And this is the crew of Apollo 11. Says they were cordial but not especially close. With these spacesuits that are quite iconic from the time. Like their chunky little boots. Alright, let's jump ahead. thing that's really fascinating about Apollo in the 70s is that you also had an Apollo-Soyuz test project. Soyuz was the Soviet space capsule. It says here this was the first American-Soviet space flight. It docked the last American Apollo spacecraft with the Soviet Soyuz for a handshake in peace. Let's see, I think we should have a picture of that too, which is 2, 4, and 2, 4, 8. So this is what these, what Skylab looked like, which was also under the Apollo program. And here we can see the Soyuz from one of the Apollo capsules. I don't think we have them. Alright, this one. This is Tom Stafford in the foreground, right here. And he shakes the hand of Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov in the climactic moment of the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So, quite an important moment in the history of spaceflight. Starting in the 1980s, we have the era of the space shuttles. And you can see this goes on for quite a while. We have 2 entire pages of space shuttle missions. Another 2 pages here, all the way up to 2011. And then in 2011 with Atlantis, we have the final flight of a space shuttle. The shuttles were Atlantis, Endeavour, Discovery, and then of course there was also the Columbia and the Challenger. What we don't have here is the very first prototype that was built, which was called Enterprise. There's a really cute picture with the crew of the Starship Enterprise of the TV series, but it's not included in this book. I guess that doesn't fall under NASA jurisdiction. I really like the way the space shuttles look. Let's see where we have them. Oh, right here. So this here would be the Discovery. You can see here the command center. In the back we have the Canada arm. Canada. And here we have NASA astronaut Scott Kelly looking at him and the Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko began a year-long stay aboard the station. And the interesting part was that Scott Kelly has a twin brother, Mark, who's also a shuttle commander. And he stayed behind on Earth so that his DNA could be compared against Scott's after the mission was completed. I remember this because Scott Kelly was tweeting from the space station. Of course, not just him. You have plenty of astronauts tweeting from the space station by now. But I think that's a really fascinating aspect of spaceflight. That astronauts can just send you pictures directly from space and tell you about what they're doing. and how their experiments are going. We have the space station right here. The ISS has been continuously occupied since November 2000. Its habitable volume is equivalent to a Boeing 747. An international crew of 6 people live and work while traveling at 5 miles or 8 kilometers per second, orbiting Earth once every 90 minutes. This is the single most complex and ambitious engineering effort in history, even when compared to Apollo. So, very, very impressive. I actually wanted to look at the space shuttles, but I guess we got sidetracked by the space stations. Here we have the Atlantis launching. This one too is the Atlantis, with a beautiful background here. And this was the last time that a space shuttle conducted an International Space Station crew changeover. And since then, they've been dependent on the Soyuz. This is pretty cool. We have the main booster elements of a Soyuz rocket still in use today. They are based on the R-7 missile that kicked off the space age by launching Sputnik 1 in 1975. Thus, the Russian Space Agency prefers to use updated versions of rocket hardware that has proved its reliability over 6 decades. Very few failures have occurred after more than 1,700 launches, carrying a wide variety of manned and unmanned payloads. Here we have Mae Jemison on board the Endeavour. You can see what it looks like on the inside. And here we have 77-year-old Mercury 6 veteran John Glenn returning to orbit in 1998 on the Discovery. Alright, I also wanted to look at some of the unmanned space flights that we have here. Selected robotic programs. But I think we could keep that for another time. It's already been quite a lot of information. So let me know if you'd be interested in the Voyager programs, Pioneer 10 and 11, Dawn Orbiter, New Horizons. And we can come back to this. So for tonight, I hope you have sweet dreams, maybe of outer space. And I'll see you again next week